Well, if they did fall on deaf ears, but it's just the latest example in the really day by day, the deepening trade war that is underway between the United States and China. Yes, we are learning that U.S. officials privately behind the scenes urged China to not retaliate. In fact, the Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has been saying that publicly all along, warning countries to not retaliate. Well, those warnings have fallen on deaf ears, particularly with China, as they raise their tariffs to 125%. The question now is which side is going to blink?
They did not expect China to strike so quickly. While Washington had just approved the 145% tariffs, Beijing had already launched an economic operation that could not just shake up world trade, but change the very architecture of global influence. Over the past 72 hours, China has unleashed a series of steps that the White House feared but did not want to acknowledge: retaliatory duties, a freeze on rare earth supplies, a blow to U.S. defense companies, and, most importantly, a full-scale techno-divorce from the West. This is not just an economic confrontation. It is an open trade war where the stakes are not billions of dollars, but control over the future.
Right now, 145 going up against 125. These are the tariffs between the world's two biggest economies.
And here's another number, 4,700 or about $400 per month. That is how much more money Yale's now estimating, the Yale Budget Lab, that President Trump's tariffs are going to cost average households each year. And with just hours left in trading, the Dow right now.
For the first time in 40 years, Europe broke first. The president of the European Commission first threatened sanctions, then reversed course with a lightning-fast offer of zero industrial tariffs to the US. But China is not Europe. It didn't back down. It went all in, zeroing out trade relations with the Netherlands' ASML and Taiwan's Smink, cutting off channels to US technology and beginning to dump US Treasury securities. This is no longer about trade. It's about power. If China continues to sell US assets, the markets will collapse. And it's not just corporations that will suffer, but ordinary Americans, their pensions, their loans, their paychecks.
Up. You're seeing that swing here going into the afternoon, up almost 650 points. But it was up and down there throughout earlier in the day. With us now, we have CNN business editor-at-large Richard Quest. We have CNN chief national security analyst Jim Sciutto as well. Richard, a key economic gauge, the consumer sentiment now at its second lowest level on record, going back to 1952. Why?
Against this backdrop, the Canadian Prime Minister is preparing to divert millions of barrels of oil from the American market to Europe and India. The US may face fuel shortages for the first time in decades, which have already begun to affect New England gas stations. Gas has gone up 40 cents a gallon. But that's just the beginning. If supplies are diverted, US refineries will have to retool entire production chains. That's not weeks or months, it's years and billions in losses.
We shouldn't be surprised with all that's coming out and all the worries about tariffs. It's not just that, it's the complexity of everything else as well. The changes within the federal government, the worries about job losses, the worries about a slowing economy, higher inflation, and eventually you get these what's known as soft data.
Meanwhile, in the US, there's an internal explosion. More than 1,300 protests have swept the country, from California to Montana. But not against China, but against the White House. Industrialists, farmers, teachers, small business owners are all taking to the streets because Trump's new tariff policies are destroying their daily lives. Rising product prices, factory closures, layoffs, all against a backdrop of total uncertainty. America says it is protecting its own market, but who is destroying it, China or its own government?
There are surveys like the Michigan survey, consumer sentiment, and it's a really worrying number because at some point these sentiment surveys feed into hard data of real consumer spending. And we know this from history and precedent, that's what happens. So when we see a number as bad as this one, it is only a matter of time, unless anything else changes that would suddenly make people more cheerful. Look at that chart. I mean, just look at it. Unless people suddenly become more cheerful, why would this not translate into spending? You see, that consumer lab, the lab from Yale, that number of 4,700, that is providing you don't start substituting goods.
And if you think that's it, you're wrong. Because Japan has just announced that it is willing to renegotiate its military and economic alliances with the US. And this is no longer just a crisis, it's a potential collapse of the entire strategy of American influence in Asia. Everything is changing right now, right before our eyes. And this is just the beginning. Don't switch, because it's only going to get tougher from here.
In other words, pre-substitution, if we just continue as we are now. But of course, people will start to substitute. They will find other goods. And as the Christmas Tree Association said a moment or two ago, it's going to be very difficult to find substitution of many things that we currently get from China.
America has woken up to a new reality. While some politicians cheerfully applauded the White House's resolve, others whispered of an impending collapse. Donald Trump announced the imposition of 145% tariffs on Chinese goods, an amount that includes the 20% already in place. The decision came as no surprise, but its scale, speed, and political aggression literally paralyzed parts of the government. In the first hours after the announcement, bewilderment reigned in the corridors of Congress. Uncoordinated agencies muddled their comments, and officials from the International Trade Council were dismissed after trying to claim that the final numbers were still under discussion. Turns out, no, the numbers have already been signed off on, and the consequences have begun to unfold in real time.
Yeah, you'll be surprised just how much we get exclusively from China. And Jim, I'm really curious to get your perspective on the White House's handling of this situation. Not so much the tariffs that have been announced, but this reporting that the White House, that officials have made clear to Beijing that they want Xi to ask for a call with Trump.
What makes this 145% particularly devastating is not the figure itself, but its focus. The new tariffs hit not monopolies or multinational giants, but the very heart of China's export model, small and medium-sized businesses. Companies that account for about 60% of China's exports and generate 80% of private sector employment have come under direct fire. Already in the first quarter of 2025, according to the Hong Kong Association of Industries, orders for Chinese small exporters have fallen by 30%. That's not a correction, it's a collapse. Several provincial governments, such as Guangdong and Fujian, have already requested emergency subsidies from the central government to stabilize the manufacturing sector. Chinese newspaper Global Finance even published a forecast that up to 1.5 million jobs could be lost by the end of the summer if the US does not ease tariff pressure. The panic has spread to foreign investors as well. Companies such as Bosch, Panasonic, and Adidas, which had previously used China as a key production center, began to urgently consider moving capacity to Vietnam, Malaysia, or India. According to unofficial reports, some 47 foreign corporations, including even a few American ones, Honeywell and 3M, for example, have begun secret consultations on a partial exit from the Chinese market, fearing reputational and logistical risks. Investment banks in Shanghai recorded massive withdrawals of foreign exchange reserves amid rumors of a possible devaluation of the yuan if exports do not recover in the coming months. Beijing was forced to hold a closed-door meeting with the governor of the People's Bank of China to discuss extreme measures to stabilize the financial system.
The Chinese impression is that they are willing to at least negotiate, not necessarily on Donald Trump's terms, but to talk. But their impression is that the U.S. has not opened channels and not made an effort to open up channels.
But the crisis quickly spread beyond China's borders. Europe, having heard Trump's statement that global tariffs are the new world order, could not stay away. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen was the first to react, calling the U.S. tariff policy an economic dictate. In the first day after the White House statement, the EU announced the preparation of retaliatory measures, including 25% tariffs on US steel, aluminum, as well as limiting imports of American cars. Brussels prepared an 83-page dossier with specific countermeasures. If the United States foments a trade war, Europe will not stand by, von der Leyen said.
to allow that. So now you have the U.S. president say, well, I'm not going to open those channels. China has to open them first. It's kind of ridiculous at the end of the day, because you are playing with the interests of American consumers, Chinese consumers, etc. The other point I would make about China's reaction today in not quite meeting the U.S. tariffs, 145%, U.S.-China goes to 125. And in Xi's statement, he says, we're going to 125 in response. That's as high as we're going because this is getting a little ridiculous, right? And that's both a signal to say we're not going to get caught up in this tit for tat to the degree that the president is.
However, suddenly and suspiciously quickly, the vector changed dramatically. Just 4 days later, the same Ursula von der Leyen spoke with a completely different tone. From the rostrum of the European Parliament, she announced, "We are ready to negotiate with the United States. We propose a zero-for-zero scheme on industrial goods. We are in favor of free and fair trade." The statement caused shock, even within the European Commission itself. Rumor has it that the night before the speech, it was contacted privately by representatives of the US State Department, offering special conditions on energy in exchange for a waiver of counter-sanctions. There were also rumors that the US promised to temporarily increase LNG supplies to Europe, closing possible energy shortages. This abrupt reversal has put the EU in an ambiguous position. First, tough rhetoric, readiness for trade resistance, and calls for global solidarity. Then, diplomatic capitulation, presented as strategic flexibility. Against the background of all this, China looked not so much aggressive as consistent and principled. Beijing officially refused to make concessions, saying it would not lift its 34% retaliatory tariffs until the US dropped its own. Moreover, China has stepped up countermeasures, restricting exports of rare earth materials and imposing new sanctions on US military and technology companies including Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, and even AI and quantum computing startups. The US press, meanwhile, was bifurcated in its assessments. The Wall Street Journal called for a hard line, if not now, when? Was the headline of a column in the Wall Street Journal, sounded the headline of one of the columns. The Atlantic, on the contrary, warned 145% is not a tariff. It's suicide. CNBC sounded the alarm. As the conflict escalated, the stock market began to sag, and the SP 500 index lost 4.2% for the week, the sharpest collapse since the fall of 2022.
But it's also an opening to say, okay, we're capping this for now, and that perhaps offers a way forward that we could begin talking about how to bring these down.
Inside the US, uncertainty was building. Internal conflicts began to surface in the Senate, with some Republicans openly opposing Trump's actions, accusing him of irresponsible escalation. One senator from Indiana, Shelby Reed, said that the White House is playing with fire, with no plan to put out the fire. At the same time, the U.S. Commerce Secretary was summoned to a closed-door hearing where he had to explain why major automakers, from Ford to General Motors, are preparing to freeze production because of the disruption of component shipments from China. But the big question remains, how will this escalation end? And who will ultimately stay afloat? China, with its vulnerable export model but strong domestic mobilization. The US, with its ambitious policies but fragile consumer economy. Or Europe, balancing principles and interests. There are no answers yet. But one thing is clear. This is not another round of trade conflict. This is a new phase of global redistribution of economic influence. And the first shot has already been fired.
Lived in China. You've covered China for some time now. As we're looking at this question of who's going to blink first, with two very different political systems, what is your gauge on this?
Well, different systems, listen, one's a democracy, one is not. One's a single-party state, very much not a democracy. But China does have politics, and Chinese leaders do not want to be seen, we were talking about this yesterday, I believe, do not want to be seen as capitulating to America. That is not good politics for a Chinese leader.
And that's just the external pressure. Domestically, the situation is no less explosive. Already in mid-April, the U.S. Department of Labor recorded an increase in applications for unemployment benefits in industrial states, Ohio, Michigan, Indiana. In Detroit, the heart of the U.S. auto industry, 3 assembly plants in a row have closed. The reason is disruptions in the supply of parts made in China. Ford and General Motors are urgently reviewing supply chains, and labor unions are demanding emergency subsidies from the government. One engineer at Ford's Dearborn plant admitted to the local Detroit Press newspaper that he had been furloughed for the first time in 12 years. "We just don't have anything to assemble. Cars are not just one body, it's tens of thousands of parts, and if you lose even one, everything stops," he said. The situation is no better in the agricultural sector. China, one of the biggest buyers of US soybeans, corn and meat, has cut imports by nearly 40%. In Iowa, farmers are already taking losses. Warehouse sheds are overflowing with unsold produce, and banking institutions have begun demanding early payments on ag loans. The US Corn Growers Association reports that some farmers are facing a situation where the cost of production is above the market price, even in the domestic market. One farmer from Powell County, Iowa, on radio station Craig said, "We put everything in, fertilizer, rent, machinery. Now they're telling us be patient, it's for big politics, but patience goes with the money." But the most dangerous, according to some experts, is yet to come. If the protests unite into a more sustainable movement, blockades of transportation routes, strikes, and even a wave of economic sabotage cannot be ruled out. There are already precedents. In Illinois, a group of farmers refused to deliver grain to export terminals in protest of tariff policy, disrupting logistics for 2 days. Such actions nationwide could paralyze critical sectors. And while the White House administration continues to pretend to control the situation on the ground is already spiraling out of control. All these events are happening simultaneously, reinforcing each other like a closed loop. International pressure, domestic anger, and economic stagnation are turning the US economy into a chessboard where the pieces are arranged, but no one is sure who is on which side. And the most troubling thing is that no one has an answer to the question, how can we bounce back if the game has already begun? The formal reason was a US initiative to pressure the Dutch government to revoke export licenses for Dove equipment supplied to China. These machines are critical for the production of chips at 7 nanometers and below. Behind the scenes, however, analysts say something else. China knew this move was coming and had been preparing for it for years. Beginning in 2022, through a series of hidden government funds, Beijing began infusing what is now estimated to be more than $75 billion. These funds have gone into developing domestic lithography facilities, building full-service factories, and, importantly, aggressive staff hiring. More than 50,000 engineers have been brought back to the country from foreign companies, including Google, Apple, and even NASA, offering salaries 2 to 3 times the market rate. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. China has gone further. The sell-off of US assets has begun. Within 1 month, more than $200 billion in US treasuries was withdrawn from Chinese accounts. This was the largest single-stage withdrawal of a foreign holder from the US debt market in history. At the same time, Beijing quietly began dumping shares in the Big Five companies Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, Nvidia, and Alphabet. These sales were conducted through Singapore and London proxy funds, but their nature was obvious. As a result, the Nasdaq index had its worst performance since March 2020. The press started talking about China's soft currency attack. The idea was to wreak havoc on the market without resorting to sanctions by destabilizing assets directly dependent on Chinese investments. The result was immediate. Pension funds tied to the Nasdaq and SP 500 began recording losses. Some of them, including Teachers' Retirement Fund of Ohio, said liquidity had fallen to critical levels. In regions where these funds serve as the primary source of benefits, accruals are projected to be delayed as early as May. And all of this is just from the first steps in the currency confrontation. With the housing market already on the brink, this could lead to a new wave of the 2008 crisis. Against this backdrop, another key player, Japan, has come into play. After the US imposed an additional 25% tariff on car imports, with a direct targeting of the Japanese auto industry, Tokyo was no longer deterred. The foreign minister said, "No sovereign state is obliged to take unilateral decisions that harm its economy. We are ready to reconsider all formats of cooperation." This phrase was circulated the same day by major Japanese media, changing the tone from diplomatic to almost military. 72 hours later, the Japanese parliament began hearings on the possibility of redistributing defense contracts from American to European companies. Negotiations are already underway with Dassault, France, Rheinmetall, Germany, and Saab, Sweden, to substitute supplies of military equipment, including ship-based air defense systems and fifth-generation fighters. At the same time, more than 1 million Americans are employed by Japanese companies within the United States. Toyota, Honda, Nissan have plants in Tennessee, Alabama, Ohio. Their fate is now in question. If Japanese businesses decide to cut production in the US and refocus on other markets, the blow to employment will be catastrophic. And it's not just about jobs. Japan has been the largest investor in the US economy for the past 4 years. If that stream begins to dry up, infrastructure projects, local banks, and the hundreds of small contractors on which entire counties depend will be affected. Most troubling is the strategic side of the issue. Japan has served for decades as a key US ally in Asia, forming a buffer between Washington and Beijing's growing influence. Losing this pillar amid China's technological push and economic pressure could lead to a loss of control over the entire Indo-Pacific region. On the sidelines of the Pentagon, the possibility of moving additional forces to Guam and the Philippines to compensate for Japan's possible withdrawal from a number of joint programs is already being discussed. However, on the diplomatic front, the situation looks increasingly unmanageable. Japanese diplomats refuse to sign joint communiques in which the US demands unconditional support. As a result, America finds itself in a position where every new initiative is met with opposition rather than response. China is ceasing to be the factory of the world and is becoming a techno giant in its own right. Canada and Japan, key partners and suppliers, begin to build alternative alliances. And domestically, there is social tension, economic disruption, and a protest movement sweeping all 50 states. The world in which the US dictates the rules is ceasing to exist before our eyes. And now the question is not what happens next, but will they stop it before it's too late?